So basically, I would say it's discounts are never good. It should never be something that you just give to the customer to be nice, but it should reward good customer behavior. So quid pro quo would be one rule for giving discounts, saying, okay, you can get a discount, but what can you give me in return? Is it higher volume? Is it a reference that you give me, a testimonial, whatever? So try to make it not a one-way street. Try to apply a quid pro quo rule, saying, okay, you can give a discount, but then you get me something.
Hey folks, what's up? I'm Harni and you're listening to The Price Tag. Today my guest is Manuel Wätjen. Manuel started out as a strategy consultant and then quickly moved into Vocatus, which is a behavioral science-powered pricing and selling consultancy. He's been there for 13 years and is now an executive board member there. In this next 30 minutes, we talk about how you can use behavioral economics to strategize and implement your pricing. We talk in depth about how different types of consumers make purchasing decisions and how you can influence those decisions. We talk about why discounts are like drugs and so much more. Let's dig in. I am super excited to have you in the podcast, especially this episode, because I'm a behavioral economics and consumer psychology nerd myself, and having you in here is just my absolute dream, honestly. I can't wait to dig into all the ways you can use behavioral psychology in pricing. But okay, let's just start with you, right? Could you give us a little background on your history, on your journey till date?
Yeah, of course. I'm also have been interested in consumer psychology, so I did study psychology and social sciences. And after that, I started out being a consultant for a strategy consultancy. And I always felt kind of that the recommendations that we gave were based kind of on like gut feeling or benchmarks or best practices, and not so much on how consumers actually behave. And that's the reason why I joined Vocatus, which is focused on understanding consumer behavior. They had a very good reputation back then when I joined. I think that was like 13 years ago. And yeah, that's how I came into the consumer psychology topic and also the topic of pricing, because one of the founders of Vocatus had already or did write his doctoral thesis on pricing psychology. And so Vocatus was always a lot focused on pricing. And since this is a quite relevant topic for any company, this is our positioning. And nowadays we do a lot of projects in pricing and selling. So that's really the focus. And we are always basing that on behavioral economics, as you already said.
Got it. So you focus only on pricing strategy for companies, right?
Yeah, pricing and selling, we take that as kind of two sides of the same. So pricing strategy is how is your pricing model looking like? What is the price structure of your offering? And sales optimization means, okay, how do we get our prices enforced and executed in the market? So once we have our offering, once we have our pricing, how can we enable sales to get the prices that we want in the market? So it's always kind of both perspectives that we take. So one is more the strategy side, the price setting side, and the other is more the price execution, the selling side, and we combine both.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so how would you actually define behavioral economics?
I mean, the simplest way to put it is, I think, behavioral economics is the science of human decision making. So whenever we want to explain or predict or influence human behavior or customer behavior, then we need to rely on behavioral economics. So that would be the broad term, I think. And it kind of draws from sociology, social sciences, from marketing, psychology, economics. And as I said, the objective is always to understand and influence human decision-making behavior.
Got it. So I think Dan Ariely talks about predictably irrational in his book, right? He has a whole book on that. I thought it was super interesting. So behavioral economics talks about how people make irrational decisions, but they're predictably irrational. So what are some examples of this kind of predictably irrational behaviors that you've seen, from consumers when it comes to pricing?
Yeah, to be honest, I don't like that term irrational, not too much, because I think we should rather think of people making decisions efficiently. Because if we define irrationality as utility maximization, probably non-behavior is actually rational because people just don't have the cognitive capacities to process all the information out there to come to utility maximizing and in that sense rational decisions. So the question rather is there any strictly rational decision out there? And I would say no, it is not, because we always have to do shortcuts and use the heuristics in order to really use our capacities, cognitive capacities efficiently and then really come to decisions. So I would say any behavior is irrational, but that doesn't mean it's a deficiency or is a bad thing. It's just a way to efficiently use the resources that we have. So it really comes down to evolution. So there are some decision strategies that have been developed over time during the evolution that just turned out to work for us. So for example, relativity is a very prominent example of irrational behavior, and it just says we tend to overestimate the differences between items, for example, between prices or between light and darkness. And that's not a bad thing. It's a good thing because it makes us, or it made our ancestors in the past see dangers out there earlier than others. So if we see the danger, the tiger in the bushes earlier because we overestimate or over the difference, it's actually a good thing because it made us survive. And that's kind of how I would think about behavioral economics. But maybe take it to business. So like every strategies that customers use in order to make a decision and to say, okay, that's a good choice, is a irrationality. So maybe you know that famous slogan of IBM, no one ever got fired for buying IBM.
Yep.
That's kind of an irrational behavior because probably IBM is maybe too expensive for the company and it doesn't really fit the needs, but it's kind of gives you the security that you made a right choice. And you will probably not be fired for that. So it's smart, it's reasonable, it's not utility maximizing, it's not rational, but it's a good strategy to apply.
Yep.
Or think of, I don't know, if you have a purchasing organization and the buyer wants to negotiate a discount, that's also a strategy because maybe he is incentivized by negotiating a discount. It's not necessarily rational because maybe he doesn't look at the total cost of ownership, he just looks at what is the best deal that he can get. But that's a strategy that makes sense for him, that makes him survive in the company, although it's not really rational. And so I would say irrationality is not that good of a word. I would say it's smart and reasonable strategies that are efficient. They are not perfect. They are not optimal, but they are good enough to work in the situation where we have to make a decision under time pressure, etc.
Got it. So I've heard of this particular, I think I read this in Influence, I'm not sure. So people assume that if something's costlier, then it's just of better quality, right? If something's cheap, then it's probably just not good quality. So stuff like that, right? What are some common behaviors that you see out there that maybe people who price their own products need to keep in mind or account for?
Yeah. So the one that you mentioned is kind of an example of that people don't have the information to assess the quality of a product because they don't know the technical details. So they take price as an indicator for quality. So that's not rational, but it can work sometimes. And in some industries, it works really well. Think of, I don't know, smartphones or Apple, etc. They educated the customers really well to say, okay, if it's more expensive, then it's better. And it actually is. So that's kind of a strategy that works because people don't have the information. But getting back to your question, I think one principle that is really, really important is that relativity principle, saying that people are not able to evaluate information in an absolute sense, but only relative to other information. So for example, whether something is good or bad or expensive or reasonably priced depends on the context. So what kind of other information you have. So what we need to do in pricing and marketing, we need to understand the context to see, okay, do people perceive our prices as high or low? And we can manage that context actively. So for example, if you think about like tech companies or SaaS companies, many of the companies didn't raise their prices for many years. So since people did not have a relation to compare it, or they just thought of, okay, they never raised prices, even a very small price increase is perceived as very painful. And so what you can do then in this situation is you can try to shift the reference or change the context in a way that the price increase that you want to execute seems less painful. So a very easy example, if you say, okay, we need to design or draft a price increase letter and we want to raise our prices, say, by 5%, then we can refer in that letter to context information. For example, we can say, okay, the general inflation rate or the rate of energy cost is increasing by, 10%. And then given that change of the context, that anchor information that you give, the 5% that you want to execute seems less of a pain or more digestible. So that's one way how to think about context. And that's what really one key insight of behavioral economics. We need to understand what is the context, what is the expectations that customers have, and we need to think about how to actively manage that context. And that it also holds for example, portfolio design. I mean, that good, better, best portfolio idea is very prominent in software and in behavioral economics. And one reason why it works is because it makes it very easy for people to opt for the middle option, because once you have a high-priced option in the end, people evaluate the middle option relatively to that price anchor or that high anchor, and then it seems more reasonably priced.
Yeah, it's almost like the decoy effect, right? You have a super high price and like something slightly closer. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. The decoy works. It's a very similar mechanic. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, makes sense. So there are a lot of effects that are based on behavioral economics. So there's anchoring, there's decoys, we just spoke about that. There's endowment effect, there's like quite a few, right? But what are, say, top 5 that companies need to account for when they're going through a pricing strategy process? Like, okay, I'm gonna figure out this entirely new pricing strategy for my product, and these 5 things are just stuff that I need to keep in mind. So what are like 5 effects that you'd say?
Yeah, first of all, I would say it depends, because we would be careful in saying, okay, one effect works in every situation and we just can copy and paste it to any situation. It really depends on the experience that customers have made, which explain which effect works or doesn't work. So for example, an SML portfolio works because of the tendency towards the middle effect. So whenever customers are not sure what is fitting their needs, what they actually want, they feel better choosing the M option because that seems the least risky one. So if you have a situation where customers are more risk avoiders than SML. So if we have a situation like this, tendency towards the middle, which is an effect, could work well. So basically, one effect that is really universal, I guess, is also less is more. Less is more meaning more information and more value or more features can make a product actually less attractive overall. And I think that's really important, especially for the tech industry, because when we think of designing our products, we often assume that the more features we bundle into an option, the more attractive the bundle will become in the end. But in reality, however, we need to think of value, or overall value is more a function of the average than the sum of the features or the sum of the individual values of the features. So if you have a bundle with 5 very good features, adding 1 feature or 2 features of average or low value will not increase the total value of the offering, but decrease it, because the average will shrink. And that's really important, because we should think about building products not so much as how much individual features and individual value can we add, but more like what is the really compelling and concise story that option or product is telling. And that means, okay, few features are better if they sum up to a consistent story, rather than trying to add more and more features, and then the customers will just get confused and say, okay, there's some good features, some bad features, so overall it's like average. So really focusing on what's really valuable, what really tells a story is very important, and that holds for product design, but also for the sales approach. I mean, especially in tech, we see selling being quite cumbersome, because the sales people go to the clients and go through a long list of features, and then customers are just getting confused and don't see the story anymore. And to have that really precise and concise story is very important, and that's why I think less is more is so important in pricing and in selling. So that would be my top 3, so to say, after relativity and anchoring. I think also a similar effect is paradox of choice. So from a rational perspective or from a classical economic perspective, we would assume that more options are always better, because you kind of achieve a Pareto optimum. So if you add another option, some people will like it, others will be fine with the existing option, but it doesn't make the situation worse. But in fact, we know that the more options you add, the more the likelihood of making a wrong choice increases. And that makes it harder for customers to come actually to a decision. So you need to think of the number of options that you offer, not only in a sense of which kind of different customer needs do we tackle, but also is it something that really makes the decision easier or harder for the customer? And it could make the decision easier. So for example, if you add a very expensive option as a top tier in a portfolio, you can leverage the relativity effect, and that makes the other option less appealing, less expensive. So that could help making a choice. But if the options become too similar, even though in theory they would fit the needs of the customers better, they actually make the situation worse. So less is more is also very important, I guess. Maybe a fifth one that comes into selling, which I find kind of interesting. It's called the IKEA effect. It means that the more effort customer puts in something, the more valuable the product becomes. And that's a bit counterintuitive because, for example, if we think about like online sales processes, from UX, for example, we would assume that we need to reduce frictions as good as we can. So we need to make the purchasing process simple and easy and with less effort. And that is true to an extent, but it's also true that the more we involve customers in finding their solution, the more time they invest, the more valuable the product becomes. And that means you should, in the sales process, involve your customers, make them help you designing the best options, make them invest time. So just call the customers, talk with them, make them invest time in the process. And then in the end, they will be more likely and willing to bring that transaction to an end, because you could also call that sunk costs effect. If I have invested time in calling or talking with a vendor, that sometimes I say, okay, I want to close the deal with that vendor. So it's not always a good idea to reduce effort and time. It could make sense to involve the customer along the decision process, and that is really leveraging the IKEA effect.
Got it. Could you give us some examples for any of these effects that you've come across while actually consulting?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the IKEA effect is something very simple. So if we think, for example, about sales, what we often see is salespeople get a request from a customer, then they write their proposal, send a proposal, and then they call the customer after they send the proposal and say, okay, is it good, is it bad, what can we improve, etc. And it is much better to call the customer in advance to get to know them better and to ask some questions, so to make them invest time. And that leverages the IKEA effect and give the customer the good feeling, okay, it's not a standard offering that I get, but it's kind of tailored to my needs. So just taking that 5 minutes, not after sending the proposal, but before, is a very simple strategy to leverage the IKEA effect, for example.
Got it. So it comes down to customization, right? Like, oh, it's customized just for my needs. Yeah. Okay. Makes sense.
Exactly. I mean, relativity is everywhere. So just when we think about how to design portfolio options, we should think about not only in a sense that we need to sell every option, but maybe we need to design options that nobody should buy, that have only the function of letting the other option appeal more attractive. So we should not only think about in favor of which option does our customer decide, but also can we make it easy for them to decide against an option. And so maybe even you have an option in your portfolio but nobody buys, but it's still extremely relevant because that is the option that customers opt against, and they opt in favor of others that you actually want to sell. If we discuss with our customers about their offerings, we really try to understand which is the actual features that add value, what is the sales story that those features are telling us, and then let's leave out all the other features. Even if they add some marginal value, they will dilute the overall appeal. So just leave them out, not talk about them too much, and maybe offer them to niche customers, but not in the very first situation when they see the portfolio, for example, online. So really going through all the list of features and try to condense them and build a consistent story around that.
Got it. Makes sense. So there's this traditional willingness to pay concept that pops up a lot when it comes to pricing, right? And I was just reading that behavioral pricing says that while there is a predefined willingness to pay number out there that you can figure out by talking to prospects, surveys and all of that, is also this point where the price acceptance can be enlarged by almost architecting the decision-making process, right? So how can you actually do that? How do you make a consumer think, oh, okay, I can actually pay more?
Yeah. Yeah, so the point that you're making is, and that's absolutely right, there is nothing like an intrinsic willingness to pay. So if you ask customer what you're willing to pay for something, that's more like an expectation that is depending on their experience and not so much what they actually are ready to pay in a given situation. So the situation is extremely important to leverage or increase that willingness to pay. And one way to do it is just think about the naming. So for example, if you have a portfolio, a good, better, best portfolio, you should not call it like SML, but you should think about, okay, what is the actual problem and pain that the different customer segments have? And what is the story that you want to tell them with our options? So rather than saying M has that features, you can say, okay, let's name it in a way that refers to the customer's pain points. So for example, if you think about an office product, say S is maybe the office management or office organization, because, okay, some people have the pain of getting their office organized, so that's what we should appeal to. Or M is maybe then the project management naming, because you say, okay, or project efficiency naming, because their pain is getting their projects organized more efficiently. So think about what is really the compelling story rather than just giving customers the features and let them find out the story themselves. So naming or framing, as you said, is one way to increase that willingness to pay or price acceptance, as we put it. Another way is the actual situation where the customers decide for a product. So one example, it's not B2B, but it's, I think, very interesting, is the Thermomix. I don't know, this kind of multifunctional kitchen machine. It's extremely expensive. I think it's about 1,400 euros. And if you show that machine to any customer on the streets, nobody will buy it. But what they do is they sell it in demonstrations. So you are invited as a potential customer to a demonstrator, and you have like 1 or 2 hours of cooking with the machine. And then you just experience the product, you see the value, you understand it, you can relate it to your situation, and then the conversion rate in such sales demos is actually very high. And of course, that also holds for B2B. For example, there are some discussions going on in product that growth about reverse trial, meaning that you give the customers a higher value option at a lower price, or letting them experience that, because sometimes the perception of value only becomes clear if you use a product. So making customers use the product or offering an onboarding time where customers can really fully understand the features and the value and relate it to their use cases, that's one way also to increase price acceptance. And there's more like, I would say, tiny tactics to do this. Or one tactic has to do with the price optics, for example. So from a rational perspective, this would not make any difference whether a product is priced, 99 or 100 or 101 euros. But it makes a difference, which is a bit counterintuitive. So for example, if you have a customized B2B product that you offer and that you calculate, it does make sense to price it even a bit above that threshold, because if you offer a product at a price of 150 euro, that seems very sharply and fairly calculated. So if you offer that at 99, people would say, okay, that's an artificial price. It probably doesn't have to do with the cost. But if you offer it at 100, 150, then people say, okay, they really tried to get close to 100. They just didn't make it, but at least they did all the effort to come close and be very fair. So that tiny difference in terms of price optics can make a huge difference in terms of perception of the customers. And that's also one way to increase price acceptance, which is something that the rational choice theory wouldn't assume.
Got it. That's interesting. Especially about reverse trials and all of that, right? A lot of GTM motions these days as well, it's land and expand. You go in, you maybe find one team and you show value there. Cool. So what are the different types of buyers, like different personas maybe? And how do you account for them while figuring out your pricing strategy and also the journey? Like, especially, I'm assuming that there's a very price sensitive buyer persona across industries, across, everything. So how do you appeal to them?
Yeah. So rather than talking about buying personas, I would rather talk about like decision-making strategies, because that's really the essence of behavioral economics. What is the strategy that our customers apply when he approaches a specific decision? And the strategy that he applies is very much depending on his experience. And so, for example, if we think of the price-sensitive buyer, you're probably referring to a bargain hunter. A bargain hunter is a bargain hunter not necessarily because it's a personality trait of him or her. It's because he has learned or made the experience that there's always a good deal to make. Or in the B2B context, he might be forced to look at getting a better deal because he's incentivized by the rebate that he gets. So the bargain hunter would be one decision-making strategy, or a buyer persona, how you called it, who is looking for the transactional value. So he wants to get the feeling that he's kind of getting the better deal than others. So he negotiates something. And one typical mistake to deal with a bargain hunter is to give a discount too easily, because the bargain hunter wants to feel like a winner in the negotiation. So you must make it really hard for him to get. So not give the discount too early, but say, okay, I don't really know, and let me talk with my manager, and maybe we can do something, but only for you and only this time. So make it really hard and painful to get that discount. That would be a strategy for the bargain hunter. There's another rather price-sensitive type, which we call the risk avoider. The risk avoider is someone who's reacting to what I said before: no one ever got fined for IBM. So the risk avoider is also looking at the price, but more from like a defensive perspective. So he doesn't want to make a good deal. He wants to be sure that he doesn't make a wrong decision. So something that would appeal to the bargain hunter, a rebate, might make the risk avoider even more cautious or skeptical, because he says, okay, if they can give me a rebate, probably they were more expensive in the beginning and they were ripping me off all the time before I got the discount. So the biggest mistake for the risk avoider is to take the question that the risk avoider might pose, namely, can you explain the price to me, and misunderstand that question as he wants a discount, because he just really wants to understand the price. So you need to explain it to him and make it clear, but you don't have to give a discount very early. So that's one common mistake, talking about the price too early, by misunderstanding that some customers, the risk avoiders, they ask for the price, but not because they want a cheaper price. They really want to understand it. So you need to be transparent here. Another strategy or decision type is price acceptors. Price acceptors are customers who have learned that the more you pay, the more you get. So that's a situation where you have kind of trained as a vendor the customer that you only get what you need if you pay more. So classical Apple example, Apple has done a really good job shifting the mobile phone market from bargain hunters to price acceptors, because they really trained the customers in a way that they understand, okay, if I want more, then I need to pay more. So price acceptors are typically also very demanding in how they talk. In B2B settings, it's very typically the project manager or the technical decider. They want to have someone who is a sparring partner for them. So as a salesperson, you need to understand the technical details and convince the customer, because the price acceptor doesn't just accept price. You need to convince him of the value of the product. So that's a strategy to deal with the price accept. A fourth strategy is the routine buyer. And the routine buyer is someone who says, I don't really care too much about the product. I made good experience with a given vendor, and as long as anything works and I don't experience any great disappointments, it's fine for me. So they say, okay, I always buy with this vendor. It worked out very well in the past. And if they send me a proposal, I buy it. It will be fine. I'm not willing to look into all the details, compare the prices. So it's more like convenience, giving him the feeling that it's the best choice. It's convenience. It doesn't take him too much time. So if you have a loyal customer base, you typically have a high share of routine buyers. And then the last type is the indifferent buyer. He's someone who is not really interested in either in price nor in product or technical details. typically it's a strategy that is driven out of an urgent need. So I don't know when we think about after sales, if there's a part broken and it just needed to be fixed, I don't do a lot of research. I don't compare prices too much. I just go where I get the solution as quickly as possible without looking at price or product. So driven by an urgent need, people can become indifferent buyers. So I think so that's kind of 5 prototypical decision strategies, which we find in B2B very often, and it's very consistent. But it's also worthwhile mentioning that not every human is the same decision-making maker in every industry, because a professional buyer might be a bargain hunter in his profession, but when he buys a smartphone, he's a price acceptor. So it's really hybrid, because it's not a typology of people or personality, it's a typology of decision-making strategies and decision-making situations, so to speak.
Wow. I can actually relate myself to, being almost all of these different types of people
Right.
when buying different kinds of things. When I'm buying a tool for my company, I'm definitely going to be a much more, I need to ensure that I don't look like a fool to my manager, exactly, yeah, that I made the right decision. When I'm in a hurry and I'm just going out buying a commodity, I don't care, right? So it's definitely very interesting. You spoke about discounts a lot, I think, especially for the first few personas, and I want to focus on that, right? Like, when is it a good strategy to give discounts? Because I think giving discounts a lot kind of diminishes your image, and you kind of train your buyer to actually, oh, I'm only going there when they have discounts. I'm not coming there. Otherwise, their actual price is probably that. So why should I pay a premium? So when is it a good time to give discounts?
Yeah, so basically I would say it's discounts are never good, but it's kind of like a drug. Once you give it to your customers, you're stuck. And that's why we have a lot of industries or markets that are driven by discounts, because we kind of have educated the customers of becoming bargain hunters. So one example is the German automotive industry. Some years ago, with the first economic crisis, 2008 and 9, the manufacturers were giving heavy discounts. And because they thought, okay, people don't buy cars anymore, we need to discount. They didn't really address the dominant motivation, because if I don't want to buy a car, it doesn't make a difference whether it's 10 or 20% cheaper. I just can't afford it. But nevertheless, there were a lot of discount out there. So the discount level on average were rising to, I don't know, like 20, 25%. And that was a situation that the automotive industry could never get rid of for many years. So they just trained the customers. They treated them as bargain hunters because they thought customers would be bargain hunters, which they were not. But once they started it, they had a bad situation. And the same is, for example, for Black Friday. I mean, Black Friday is something that just is shifting the purchases that customers would have done otherwise to a given, because people don't want to spend money on say, TV, but they are just educated. Okay, I would be stupid if I would not buy it within that week. So that said, the best way to discount or to get rid of that, and I can use drugs as an example, is either like a cold turkey. So that's something that the automotive industry experienced last year because of the shortage of raw materials. The manufacturers just couldn't produce any more cars. And if there's a shortage, they said, okay, I cannot sell, so I don't need to give discount. And what happens? They reduced the discounts, people still bought the cars, and they made like record profits. All of the OEMs, all the German OEMs, they had record profits because they used that kind of cold turkey situation, which, by the way, was more cold turkey for the dealers, because the dealers were the ones who were actually selling on price, on discounts, not so much the customers who were buying on the discounts. But that was a good situation. Another situation, to stick with that example, is more like trying to phase it out, the discounts, in a sense that applying strict rules how to give discounts. So we should be aware of that a discount should never be something that you just give to the customer to be nice, but it should reward good customer behavior. So quid quo pro would be one rule for giving discounts, saying, okay, you can get a discount, but what can you give me in return? Is it higher volume? Is it a reference that you give me, a testimonial, whatever? So try to make it not a one-way street. Try to apply a quid pro quo rule saying, okay, you can give a discount, but then you get me something. Because if you don't do that, the discount will just be the normal price, and the next time the customer calls, he will ask for a higher discount because the discount that you given once is just the new reference point. So quid pro quo would be a rule. Of course, you should give it very selectively because, okay, if you have bargain hunters in the market, and we do have a lot of bargain hunters in many markets, they need a discount. But for that one, say, okay, we should really differentiate. So say, okay, only if we are really sure that there's a customer, or if it's a customer that wouldn't have bought otherwise, then we should give the discount. If that's not the case, don't give it. So if you have a risk avoider, don't give a discount. And if we have a bargain hunter, really start with a higher entry price because he doesn't really care too much about the absolute price level, just about the deal that he makes. So start the conversation with a higher price anchor and you're being negotiated down. So that would be another rule to deal with discounts.
Got it. So when someone's coming in and, as a salesperson, this is your first conversation, figuring out which type of person they are and then customizing the pricing for them so that, oh, it's actually $40. And then you talk them down to they talk you down to 30 and that's a win for him. Okay, that makes sense. Cool. I think that's it. That's all the questions I had. Now I think we can go to the lightning round, which is always my favorite. Cool. So are you ready?
Of course.
Okay, cool. So lightning round is just a rapid fire round where I ask you questions super fast, just 5 or 6, and you tell me what's top of your mind, right? Cool. So question number 1, and this is my favorite. If you had all the money in the world and you couldn't continue doing the job that you're doing right now, what would you do for the rest of your life?
Probably I would travel more. Yeah, that would be the top thing.
Okay. Yeah. I've heard that one a lot. It's the same for me as well.
After Corona, it's quite an urgent need for
Yes.
everybody.
Yes, exactly. Okay. So what is your favorite book?
My favorite book, there's quite a lot of books. So you mean professionally or?
No, you can tell your top 3, professionally, personally, everything.
Yeah, professionally, I think it's Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, because that's really the foundation of behavioral economics. I also read Never Split the Difference, which is a deal-making book. I also like that a lot because there are some principles of behavioral economics in there which I wasn't aware of because I wouldn't think that's a behavioral economics book, but it still has a lot in common, thinking about anchoring and how to deal with negotiations. And then one that I just recently read is a German book. It's called Allein of Daniel Schreiber. It's Alone. It's really a very different speak. It's just the biography of one single person who is living his life in his 40s or something and philosophing about life. So that's one favorite of mine that's top of mind.
Oh. Is it deep and sad or?
It's melancholic and deep, but not sad, I would say.
Okay, that's nice. All right.
That gives me a lot to think about life and different styles of living. So that's also one of my favorites right now.
So who are some people that you would suggest, we should follow if we're into pricing? And what are some good resources out there, whether it's books, whether it's, I don't know, something else?
Yeah, so I mean, it's always a bubble. So since I'm a lot on LinkedIn, I would check my LinkedIn contacts. So I quite like the Impact Pricing podcast. Mark Stiving, he has interesting guests, and I also would regard most of the guests as worthwhile following. So, I don't know, Stephen Ford of Ibaka, Mark Peacock, Mark Stiving himself, of course, my colleague Florian Bauer. And then depends on the specialty. I mean, in product-led growth, it would be Leah Therin and
Yes.
Werner.
Oh, she's my hero. Yeah.
On LinkedIn, I think Leah got from thousands to 30,000 in months or weeks.
Yep.
But that's really a niche. So, yeah.
Yep. Got it.
Of course, I would try to... I try to expand the bubble, but it's hard because, it's social media and you always get to see the same content. So
that's true.
Have your eyes open and not only following the people that you always see in your feed is
Yeah,
probably a good advice as well.
that makes sense. What about like resources though? So books, especially if you could talk about maybe behavioral science related,
Yeah.
because that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it's really the classics. It's really like Kahneman and Thaler, Tversky, Ariely. I mean, Ariely is a bit, I think, standing on the shoulders of the latter. So he's good in summarizing it, but I think it makes sense to go a bit more to the founders.
So if someone were to start like learning about behavioral economics and consumer psychology, what would be like a book that they could start with?
Yeah, I would start with Kahneman, and that's actually
Kahneman.
how I come into it. So
Oh,
that was, I think, my first behavioral economics book. So
okay, that's nice. That's amazing. Thank you so much for coming in. That's all the questions I had. You've been such a fun guest, and I've honestly learned so much, and I hope our listeners have as well. Where can people find you?
at vocatus.com or on LinkedIn is probably the easiest way.
Okay, perfect. If you've made it till here, thank you so much for listening. In the next episode, I will be talking to John Kotowski about pricing PLG products. See you there.